Dear listener, welcome back to another enthralling installment of Miss Marple Detective Tales. If this is your first encounter with our little corner of intrigue, do allow me to extend a warm invitation. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell, for we deliver daily doses of mystery, suspense, and the kind of thrilling tales that would surely earn a nod of approval from our dear Miss Marple herself. And if you find yourself delighting in our stories, a like would be most appreciated, a small token of your support, if you will. To those of you who have returned, how splendid to have you back. Your presence is always a pleasure, and we are ever so eager to embark on yet another unforgettable journey into the shadowy realms of mystery. So, settle in, my dear friends, as we prepare to unravel another tale that promises to keep you on the very edge of your seat. Let us begin, shall we? The morning sun slanted through lace curtains, casting a pattern of light and shadow across the floral wallpaper of Miss Agatha Marple's sitting room. A soft breeze stirred the embroidered doilies resting on polished mahogany, carrying with it the scent of roses from the garden beyond the window. In the quiet hush of St. Mary Mead, the world moved at a measured pace save for the occasional scandal involving someone's missing brooch or an ill-advised elopement. Miss Marple, perched in her high-backed chair with the poise of a woman who had long mastered the art of observation, lifted a delicate china cup to her lips. The tea had cooled, forgotten the moment she had unfolded the morning paper. Her soft, lined face and unassuming mask of sweetness gave no outward sign of alarm, but a closer look would have revealed the faint tightening at the corners of her mouth, the slight hesitation before she turned the page. Her sharp blue eyes, magnified slightly by gold-rimmed spectacles, scanned the headline again. High-speed train claims 5 lives, prominent engineer among the dead, a gruesome business. She let her gaze drift to the grainy photograph beneath the headline. The wreckage was a tangled mess of steel and smoke, the proud machinery of modern progress reduced to a broken thing in the mud. She had never trusted modernity's relentless haste. There was something unnatural about moving faster than the human mind could properly think. Her finger traced the list of casualties, and then she stopped. Harvey Thorne. She had heard that name before. Her mind, sharp as a tailor's needle, threaded back through recent conversations. Yes, Mrs. Abernathy had mentioned him at bridge last month, hadn't she? Such a brilliant man, but terribly preoccupied these days, she had said, with the sort of meaningful sigh that suggested she had found it all very intriguing. My nephew works at the railway, you know. He says Mr. Thorne was always scribbling things down, muttering about deadlines, about safety concerns. Miss Marple's lips pursed, just slightly. She did not jump to conclusions, that was the habit of lesser minds, but she had seen enough of the world, even from her modest village perch, to recognize when something did not sit right. And something about this did not sit right, she read on. The train in question had been a prototype for a new high-speed line, a grand experiment in efficiency and luxury. It had been meant to reach speeds unheard of, carrying its first passengers in a matter of months. The accident had occurred during a test run, in the dead of night, with only a handful of engineers and executives aboard. The report cited mechanical failure. An unfortunate accident, the official statement claimed. Miss Marple was not in the habit of believing in unfortunate accidents. She folded the paper with precise fingers, setting it beside the teapot. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the hour. Outside in the distance, a train whistle sounded a long, lonesome cry against the quiet country morning. She sat a moment longer, thoughtful, before reaching for her knitting basket. A terrible thing, she murmured to herself, pulling out a ball of soft grey wool. And yet, I do believe I shall have to look into it. She adjusted her spectacles, a faint smile touching her lips. After all, the truth, like the finest of wool, had a way of unraveling, if one only knew where to pull. Miss Marple had just set down her knitting when the knock came at the door. 2 sharp raps, a pause, and then a third, more hesitant. She recognized uncertainty when she heard it. She rose, smoothing the folds of her sensible skirt as she made her way through the sitting room. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hush, the scent of Earl Grey still warm in the air. She opened the door to a man whose suit was well tailored but sat on him as if he'd slept in it. Albert Thorne. She had seen him once or twice at a village fete, perhaps, or outside the railway offices in London, where he handled contracts for the Modern Rail Corporation. He had the look of a man who had once been accustomed to comfort but had found, of late, that it was slipping through his fingers. "Mr. Thorne," she said, a voice light with the kind of mild curiosity that made people fill in the silences for her. He removed his hat, fingers gripping the brim just a shade too tightly. "Miss Marple, forgive me for intruding." "You're not intruding if I invite you in." She stepped aside. He hesitated, then crossed the threshold like a man stepping onto uncertain ground. She led him to a chair near the hearth, where the morning fire had burned low but still held warmth. He sat stiffly, a man not quite comfortable with his own body at the moment, as if grief had settled on his shoulders and he hadn't yet found a way to carry it properly. She poured him tea without asking and handed him the cup. His fingers trembled against the porcelain. "I read the paper," she said gently. His mouth twisted as he stared down into the tea, a muscle working in his jaw. "Then you know about Harvey?" "Yes," he exhaled sharply. It was not relief, more like the sound a man made when he realized he would have to say the words out loud. "They're calling it an accident." Miss Marple did not blink. "Are they?" He looked up sharply, as if surprised she hadn't contradicted him with the usual platitudes. "They are. But it wasn't." She folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me why." His fingers tightened around the cup. "Because my brother knew that train better than anyone. He designed half of the systems himself. If something had been wrong, he'd have caught it." His voice was steady, but his eyes told another story, raw grief, edged with something darker. Miss Marple watched him for a moment, then said, "And yet the official statement attributes the crash to mechanical failure." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Of course it does. That's the easiest way, isn't it? Unfortunate incident, tragic loss. Very sorry for the families, and then the company moves on." His jaw tightened. "They won't investigate. They don't want to." Miss Marple lifted her cup, took a slow sip. "And you do?" His gaze met hers, searching. "I need to know. Harvey, he told me things. Before the crash." His throat worked as he swallowed. "Said something wasn't right. The way they were pushing deadlines, cutting costs. He didn't like it." Miss Marple set down her tea. "Did he name anyone in particular?" Albert hesitated, then shook his head. "Not directly. But he mentioned Victoria Ramsay, the executive overseeing the project. Said she was too eager to break records, not careful enough about how." A faint breeze stirred the lace curtains. Miss Marple studied Albert carefully. His grief was genuine, but there was something beneath it, a tightness around the mouth, a flicker of fear behind his eyes. He was not simply mourning, he was afraid. "You believe he was silenced?" The words sat between them like a third presence in the room. Albert's fingers clenched around the teacup before he set it down carefully, as if only just remembering it was breakable. "Yes." Miss Marple nodded, almost to herself. She reached for the newspaper folded beside her chair and smoothed it open. The photograph of the wreckage stared back at her, all twisted steel and smoke. "The gears are slipping," she murmured. Albert stiffened. "What?" She looked up. "Nothing. Just something I read." Albert exhaled, raking a hand through his disheveled hair. "Miss Marple, I don't know what to do. The company MRC, they'll bury this. If I push too hard, I could lose my job. But I can't just let this go. I need help." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, regarding him with mild blue eyes that had seen far more than most assumed. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "I am an old woman who enjoys her garden and her knitting." She paused, letting him absorb that before adding, "But I have always found that one needn't be loud to be heard. Sometimes a whisper is quite enough to unravel an entire scheme." She tapped the newspaper lightly with one finger. You've done the right thing in coming to me. I shall see what I can find. Albert sagged, as if some part of the weight he carried had shifted. Thank you. Miss Marple smiled, but it was a small, sharp thing. Let us not thank anyone just yet, Mr. Thorne. We have a great deal of work to do. Miss Marple watched Albert Thorne with the kind of patience that made men talk too much. He had the look of someone who had gone past grief and landed squarely in the middle of something more dangerous, determination laced with fear. His hands trembled as he reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small, leather-bound book. He placed it on the table between them, as though it was something venomous. She picked it up with careful fingers. The leather was cracked at the edges, the kind of wear that came from constant use. It smelled faintly of ink and the metallic tang of industry, a worker's book through and through. It was Harvey's, Albert said, voice raw. He always kept notes, sketches, ideas. If something was on his mind, he wrote it down. Miss Marple ran a finger along the spine. It was unremarkable in every way, except for what it contained. She opened it, flipping past pages filled with precise sketches of mechanical components, annotations in crisp handwriting, small calculations penciled in the margins. Then she found the last entry. The gears are slipping. The truth is hidden inside the speed. She read it twice. Albert leaned forward. Please, Miss Marple. They're calling it an unfortunate malfunction. But Harvey told me someone was tampering with the train's design. It can't be a mere accident. Miss Marple looked up, her expression mild, but her fingers remained firm on the diary. Mr. Thorne, do you believe your brother was murdered? His throat worked. He looked away, jaw tightening. I don't know. But Harvey knew something was wrong. He said they were rushing the tests, pushing for speed without proper safety checks. He told me he stopped, pressing his lips together as though swallowing something bitter. He told me if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be an accident. Miss Marple's blue eyes flickered. She looked down at the page again, tapping one neatly trimmed nail against the words. The phrasing was deliberate. Not a frantic scrawl of a man afraid, but a precise warning. The gears are slipping, she murmured. Albert's hands balled into fists. I don't know what it means, but you're good at seeing things others don't. You notice details. Miss Marple closed the diary and placed it gently on the table. Secrets never remain buried for long, Mr. Thorne, she said. I promise to see what I can do. Albert exhaled, sagging like a man whose last hope had been acknowledged. He stood, nodding stiffly. Thank you. Miss Marple merely inclined her head. She did not believe in thanking people for things not yet accomplished. He left, pulling his coat tighter round himself, as though the world outside had suddenly grown colder. She watched him through the lace curtains, his figure swallowed up by the quiet hush of St. Mary Mead's country lane. Then she looked at the diary again. The message echoed in her mind. The gears are slipping. The truth is hidden inside the speed. A riddle. A warning. A dead man's final note. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, fingers lacing together in her lap. Outside in the distance, a train whistle cut through the air, long, low and mournful. She had made her decision before Albert Thorne had even walked through the door. She must investigate. The vicarage library smelled of old paper and pipe smoke, the kind of place where knowledge sat in dust-lined rows, waiting for the right mind to shake it loose. The afternoon light filtered through high, narrow windows, catching on the motes that drifted lazily through the still air. The vicar, an absent-minded sort, with a fondness for forgotten cups of tea, had once declared it a place of quiet contemplation. Miss Marple, seated at a sturdy oak table, found it a place of quiet revelations. She turned another page of the London Financial Register, eyes flicking over the text, with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime knowing where to look. It was all there, if one cared to see it. The Modern Rail Corporation had been busy these past few years. Too busy. She traced a gloved finger down a column of legal notices. Settlements, non-disclosure agreements, lawsuits that started and vanished like morning mist. Most were tied to the new high-speed train project, the same one that had ended in twisted steel and smoke. The official story was mechanical failure, A regrettable accident. But Miss Marple had never put much stock in official stories. She leaned back, tapping a careful rhythm on the table with her fingertips. A corporation with its fingers in too many pies, eager to silence dissent. A test run rushed to completion. A dead engineer who had suspected something was wrong. She flipped another page, catching a brief mention of Victoria Ramsay, the executive overseeing the project. She had given a statement after the crash, polished words about moving forward, about the tragedy of progress. Miss Marple had met women like Victoria before. They were always moving forward. It was the people left behind who tended to get run over. She closed the ledger with a quiet thump. A large corporation test runs, a new train design, she murmured, almost to herself. Her blue eyes gleamed behind the gold-rimmed spectacles. Lawsuits, cover-ups, my. Where there's smoke, there's often fire. A draft stirred the pages, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle howled. Miss Marple sat very still, considering what she had found. Then, with a quiet nod to herself, she reached for her coat. It was time to ask a few questions. The churchyard at St. Mary Mead had a way of swallowing sound. Even the wind seemed to move with a certain reverence, rustling through yew trees that had been standing long before any of the mourners had drawn breath. The gravestones, worn smooth by time and English weather, leaned in like silent witnesses to the living. The funeral had been brief, polite, efficient, and tinged with the quiet discomfort of a tragedy too fresh to discuss openly. The company men, sleek in dark suits, had paid their respects and departed swiftly, as if their presence was more of a formality than a grief-stricken obligation. Miss Marple, standing near the back, observed the way Albert Thorne clenched his hands behind him as the last handful of earth was cast over his brother's coffin. The stance of a man holding too much inside, when the last of the villagers drifted away, murmuring about such a shame and so very sudden. She stepped forward. Mr. Thorne. Albert turned, his face lined with something deeper than grief. He nodded stiffly. Miss Marple. She placed a gloved hand lightly on his arm. A terrible thing. He swallowed, glancing at the fresh mound of earth. It is. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faintest trace of lilies. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, waiting, letting the silence do the work. Albert exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He called me, he said, voice low. The night before the crash. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. His hand twitched at his side, fingers curling slightly. He warned me about the final test. His voice caught. He was afraid. She let that settle between them, watching the way his eyes darted guilt, hesitation, something else tangled in the grief. Did he say why? Albert hesitated. Then, finally he nodded, said they were pushing too fast, cutting corners. He didn't trust the numbers, the new parts, the speed they wanted. His voice dropped even lower. He said, if something happened, it wouldn't be an accident. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance. Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression unchanged. But inside, the pieces were beginning to shift. A troubling thing to hear from one's own brother, she said. Albert let out a short, bitter laugh. I told him to refuse, to stop the test if he had to. But he said it wasn't that simple. His jaw tightened. He sounded resigned. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet, no one at the company has raised any questions. Albert's lips pressed into a thin line. They buried it first. Mechanical failure. No inquiry, no real investigation. Just another unfortunate event in the march of progress. Her eyes flickered toward the retreating figures of the last company men disappearing beyond the churchyard gate. Yes, she said softly. How very convenient. She looked back at Albert, taking in the exhaustion, the restless fear lurking beneath his grief. A man caught between mourning and knowing too much. I do believe, Mr. Thorne, she said gently, that your brother may have left us a puzzle. Albert's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Then I hope to God you can solve it, Miss Marple. She turned, gazing once more at the fresh grave. The wind stirred again, lifting the edges of her scarf, but she barely felt it. Her mind was already moving, turning over the words, the warnings, the absence of real answers. Yes, something had gone terribly wrong on that train, and someone was very eager to keep it that way. The last shovel of earth had fallen, and the small gathering had begun its slow dissolution into murmured condolences and the shifting of coats against the damp autumn air. Albert Thorne stood stiffly beside his brother's grave, accepting words that meant little from people who meant even less. The ones who had known Harvey best were absent, either buried in their own grief or avoiding the kind of questions that came with it. Miss Marple had seen enough funerals to recognize the pattern, the platitudes, the empty kindnesses, but she wasn't watching the mourners now. She was watching the woman standing just beyond them. Half obscured by the branches of a yew tree, her presence too carefully placed to be coincidence. Victoria Ramsay. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on the handle of her handbag. She was exactly what one would expect from a woman who had climbed her way to the top of an industry dominated by men, elegant, composed, a touch too well-dressed for a funeral where she had no real ties to the deceased. Her navy coat, cinched at the waist, was expensively tailored, and the hat she wore tilted just so, a fashionable barrier between herself and those who might be watching. Except Miss Marple was always watching. Victoria's gaze wasn't on the grave. It wasn't on Albert Thorne or the vicar or any of the other mourners making their slow retreat. It was scanning the scene with the precision of someone measuring risk, calculating what could be learned from a distance. Miss Marple turned slightly, feigning interest in adjusting her gloves as she angled herself toward Albert. "You said your brother had concerns, Mr. Thorne?" Albert nodded, his mouth drawn into a hard line. "He begged me not to trust MRC, said they were pushing for record-breaking speed, ignoring all the safety measures." His voice was thick with something between anger and regret. "I told him to walk away. He said it wasn't that simple." Miss Marple followed his gaze as it dropped to the grave, his hand tightening into a fist at his side. "I take it Miss Ramsay was among those urging him forward?" she asked lightly. Albert's head jerked up. He followed her line of sight to where Victoria Ramsay lingered at the edge of the churchyard, half-turned as if she might disappear at the slightest provocation. His expression darkened. "She's MRC's golden girl," he said flatly. "Brilliant, ambitious, ruthless when she needs to be." Miss Marple's lips curved, but there was no humor in it. "And what brings her to the funeral of an unfortunate engineer?" Albert exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That's the question, isn't it?" Miss Marple continued watching as Victoria took one last glance at the grave before turning, her heels clicking softly against the damp stone path as she slipped away. She had seen enough to recognize that kind of exit. The kind that wasn't truly a retreat, just a tactical withdrawal. Miss Marple adjusted the clasp of her handbag with deliberate care. This was not going to be a matter of simple village whispers and harmless speculation. She needed to find a way into MRC. And once she did, she intended to find out exactly what Victoria Ramsay was so keen to avoid. The rain came down in a slow, methodical rhythm, tapping against the window pane like the ticking of an expensive watch. Outside, St. Mary Mead was draped in mist, the streets slick with rain, the cottages and shops tucked beneath a soft veil of grey. It was the kind of afternoon that made people linger over their tea, stoke the fire a little higher, and settle into the comfort of their homes. But Miss Marple had never been one to let the weather determine her course of action. She sat in her favorite armchair, the one closest to the fire, a neatly folded newspaper at her side, and a half-knitted woolen sock resting in her lap. The telephone stood on a small mahogany table within arm's reach, its polished brass gleaming softly in the dim light. She picked up the receiver and dialed with precise, deliberate movements. The number was one she hadn't called in some time, but Lucy Bradshaw was not the sort to forget her voice. The line crackled once, twice, and then Bradshaw residence, the clipped, no-nonsense voice of a housekeeper. "Miss Jane Marple for Miss Lucy Bradshaw, if you please," she said with the kind of pleasant authority that ensured action. A pause. Faint murmuring in the background. Then a more familiar voice, warm but edged with curiosity. "Jane." "My dear, what a surprise." "Lucy," Miss Marple said, settling deeper into her chair, "I do hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, not at all. It's rather dull today. This weather, you know, keeps all the interesting people indoors and leaves one with only one's own company. Not always a delight." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Lucy Bradshaw had always been a woman with a taste for good conversation, and even better gossip. "Well then, perhaps I can provide you with something interesting," Miss Marple said. A pause. Then Lucy's tone shifted, sharpened, just slightly. "Oh, and what would that be?" "Tell me, dear," Miss Marple said, idly adjusting the wool in her lap. "What do you know about the Modern Rail Corporation?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Just for a second. Just enough. Then Lucy let out a light, practiced laugh. "Oh, Jane, what a peculiar question. And here I thought you only concerned yourself with village affairs. Trains, now? How very modern of you." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Well, one must keep up with the times, Lucy. And I find myself in need of a small favor. I can't imagine what sort of favor I could possibly provide where railroads are concerned," Lucy said. But the way she said it suggested she could, in fact, imagine it very well. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, resting an elbow on the arm of her chair. "I need a way-in," she said simply. Lucy made a noise, part amusement, part disbelief. "Jane, dear, what on earth do you want with MRC? They're hardly the sort of people who welcome part-time staff." Miss Marple allowed a touch of innocence to creep into her voice. "Oh, I'm sure we can come up with a little arrangement. I simply need an opportunity." Another pause. This one stretched longer. Then Lucy exhaled, the sound of rustling papers in the background. "You always did have a way of making a request sound like a fait accompli," she murmured. Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, Lucy, I do hope I haven't lost my touch." A soft laugh from the other end of the line. Then Lucy sighed, resigned but intrigued. "There's a position," she said. "Temporary. Unimportant. A records assistant, paperwork, filing, nothing thrilling. But it's inside the London office." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on the telephone cord. "And would it be terribly difficult to ensure that position finds its way to an interested party?" Another soft chuckle. "For most people, perhaps. But for you, Jane, consider it done." Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. "Lucy, you are a marvel." "Indeed I am," Lucy said wryly. "And now you owe me a very long lunch the next time you're in London." Miss Marple smiled. "It would be my absolute pleasure." As she placed the receiver gently back in its cradle, she looked toward the rain-speckled window. Outside, the grey sky stretched thick and unbroken, the world blurred at the edges. A storm was coming. And she had just secured herself a front-row seat. Lucy Bradshaw's office was the kind of place where important decisions were made over neatly typed memos and stiff drinks after hours. It smelled faintly of lavender polish and ink, and the furniture, a mahogany desk, high-backed leather chairs, was arranged with the precision of a woman who preferred order over sentiment. A small clock on the mantel ticked softly, the only sound filling the space as Lucy leaned back in her chair, studying Miss Marple with a sharp gaze that had not dulled with age. "You've always had a way of surprising me, Jane," she said, steepling her fingers. "And I can't say I dislike it. But this," she tapped a neatly folded paper on her desk, "is rather a curious request." Miss Marple, seated across from her with the poise of a woman who had never asked for anything she wasn't prepared to earn, merely adjusted the cuff of her glove. "Curious, perhaps. Necessary, certainly." Lucy arched an eyebrow, then unfolded the paper. "A records assistant," she murmured. "Temporary. Dull. Not quite the kind of thing that usually draws your interest." Miss Marple smiled, the sort of smile that looked mild until you knew better. "I do find administrative work rather soothing." Lucy snorted, then leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Jane, let's not pretend I don't know you better than that. You're up to something." Miss Marple lifted her chin slightly. "Lucy, dear, Let's not pretend you aren't already intrigued. Lucy's lips twitched, but she didn't argue the point. Instead, she picked up the paper again and studied it. The Modern Rail Corporation, she mused. I assume this has something to do with that ghastly accident. Miss Marple neither confirmed nor denied. Instead, she pulled off one glove, smoothing the fabric carefully before looking up. I'll be ever so grateful, Lucy. Confidentiality is paramount, you understand. Lucy sighed, but there was amusement in it. Of course I understand. But you'd better not get yourself sacked in the first week. I shall do my best to be the very model of efficiency. Lucy reached for a pen and, with a few swift strokes, signed a note before sliding it across the desk. Take this to MRC's employment office. It's a personal recommendation, which means they won't ask too many questions. I assume you have a cover story prepared. Miss Marple folded the note neatly and tucked it into her handbag. Oh yes, a widow, supplementing her pension. Mild-mannered, unobtrusive. Precisely the sort of person who fades into the background. Lucy tilted her head, studying her friend. And yet, I imagine you'll be watching everything. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. Wouldn't dream of doing otherwise. Lucy shook her head, a smile playing at the edges of her lips. You are a menace, Jane. A very polite menace. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirts. Flattery will get you nowhere, Lucy. Oh, I suspect you're already exactly where you need to be. Miss Marple picked up her handbag, her fingers lingering briefly on the clasp. She had unraveled many mysteries before, but this was something new. She was stepping into a world of polished steel and hidden agendas, where power moved not through whispers at garden parties, but in the ink of contracts and the weight of industry. As she exited Lucy's office and stepped into the cool London air, she felt the faintest flicker of something she had not felt in years. Anticipation. A new role awaited her, and behind it, something far more dangerous. The Modern Rail Corporation loomed over the London skyline, like a fortress of ambition, all gleaming glass and steel, the kind of building where fortunes were made and lives were quietly undone. The rain from the previous night had left the pavements slick, and the morning fog clung to the edges of the city like a reluctant guest. Miss Marple, or rather Mrs. Margaret White, stepped through the revolving doors into the lobby, where everything smelled of polish and precision. The place hummed with activity, men in crisp suits and women in tailored skirts, moved with the efficiency of people who believed time was money and money was everything. She paused at the security desk, her handbag clutched neatly in gloved hands. The young man behind the desk barely looked up from his register. Name? Margaret White. She adjusted her spectacles. I believe I'm expected. The guard flipped through a list, found her name, and nodded. He reached for a temporary identification badge, sliding it across the counter. Records Department. 4th floor. Miss Fitzroy will be expecting you. Miss Marple pinned the badge to her coat, giving him a pleasant smile. You're terribly efficient, young man. The guard, unaccustomed to such niceties, looked momentarily thrown. Thank you, ma'am. She stepped toward the elevators, her pace measured but unhurried. The first rule of going unnoticed was to behave precisely as expected. A nervous woman would draw attention. An overly confident one would raise suspicion. But a mild, polite widow looking for honest work. No one ever saw past that. The lift doors opened with a soft chime, and Miss Marple stepped in, smoothing her skirt. As the floors ticked upward, she adjusted her expression into one of polite curiosity, the kind that suggested she was mildly impressed by her surroundings, but not the least bit overwhelmed. At the 4th floor, the doors slid open onto a long corridor lined with frosted glass offices. The scent of ink and freshly shuffled papers hung in the air, and typewriters clacked in the distance. A woman was waiting for her. Evelyn Fitzroy was the kind of secretary who kept entire empires running while the men in charge took the credit. Tall and sharply dressed, with dark brown hair pulled into a neat chignon, she had an air of quiet competence. Her eyes, bright with intelligence, took Miss Marple in at a glance. "Mrs. White?" she asked, a pleasant warmth in her voice. Miss Marple smiled, extending a gloved hand. "Yes, dear. Though I do hope I won't get lost in these long corridors." Evelyn shook her hand firmly. "Oh, we all do at first, but I'm sure you'll find your way." She motioned toward the offices. "The records department is just down here. A bit quieter than the rest of the building, but that's never a bad thing, is it?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said. "I find quiet places tend to yield the most interesting discoveries." Evelyn glanced at her, something flickering behind her professional smile and awareness, perhaps. "Well," she said, leading her forward, "let's get you settled in, shall we?" Miss Marple followed, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. The stage was set. Now it was time to see who would reveal themselves first. The records office was a small, windowless corner of the fourth floor, tucked away from the hum of executive discussions and the rapid-fire clatter of typewriters. It smelled faintly of ink and old paper, the scent of bureaucratic routine. Shelves lined the walls, filled with neatly labeled files, years of documentation, financial reports, blueprints, and the kind of paperwork most people skimmed, but never really read. A long wooden desk stood against one wall, its surface cleared except for a typewriter and an ink blotter. Miss Marple settled herself in with quiet efficiency, smoothing her skirts as she adjusted a stack of folders. She ran a gloved hand along the worn edge of the desk, taking in her surroundings without seeming to. The hum of air conditioning provided a steady backdrop, punctuated by the occasional murmur of voices from beyond the door. A ticking clock on the far wall kept time with the measured pace of a place where everything moved according to policy, where secrets could hide in plain sight, buried beneath the weight of routine. She had spent a lifetime understanding that the most valuable information was never in the official reports but in the spaces between them. And so, as she sorted the files in front of her, she listened. The first voices drifted in from the corridor, two men, walking briskly past the office door. "If the boss finds out we're behind schedule, we'll be next on the chopping block." The voice was clipped, hurried, full of the kind of worry that came from working beneath a deadline that couldn't be negotiated. The second voice was quieter, almost a hiss. "Keep your voice down, you know what happened to Thorne." Miss Marple's hand paused briefly over a folder. Then the voices faded, their owners moving past and disappearing down the hall. She let out a slow breath and reached for her handbag, slipping out a small leather-bound notebook. With careful strokes, she noted the phrases, "hush hush meeting," "speed data anomalies," "behind schedule." What happened to Thorne? She tapped the pencil once against the page, considering. Harvey Thorne had been a man who asked questions. A man who understood machines, but perhaps had begun to see too much of what was happening behind the polished surface of MRC's grand ambitions. A test run that had been pushed too soon. A train that should not have failed but did. And now this. A faint, uneasy tension settled in her chest. There was more to Thorne's death than just a mechanical failure. And someone, somewhere in this building, knew exactly what it was. The MRC cafeteria was not the sort of place where one lingered over a cup of tea and idle gossip. It was sleek, efficient, and humming with the quiet urgency of business conducted between bites of luncheon. The tables were polished marble, the chairs a streamlined modernist affair, comfortable enough for a quick break, but not so much as to encourage loitering. Miss Marple stood in line, small and unobtrusive, her gloved hands folded over her handbag. The cafeteria was filled with executives and engineers alike, each absorbed in their own world of deadlines and pressure, unaware of the sharp-eyed woman who noticed everything. She scanned the menu without real interest, instead watching the movement around her through the reflection in the glass display. That was when Victoria Ramsay arrived. Victoria never entered a room so much as she took possession of it. She was a woman who had learned early that power was an illusion best maintained through confidence. Her navy silk dress was tailored to perfection, her hair in smooth waves beneath a fashionable cloche hat. She carried herself with the assurance of someone who had never had to ask twice for anything. Miss Marple, feigning interest in a particularly uninspired scone, edged closer. Victoria moved toward a table in the corner, where a man in a charcoal suit was already seated. He looked a type sharp, professional, carrying the weary look of a man who had learned too much but was paid well enough not to care. Miss Marple shifted slightly, tilting her head as if considering a selection of lemon tarts. Victoria leaned in, her voice low but urgent. "The press conference is next week. We need to control the narrative. We can't afford any more accidents." A board member stirred his coffee, his mouth set in a grim line. Harvey Thorne was a warning. "We must ensure no one else disrupts the rollout." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. Victoria's expression did not change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "You're sure there are no loose ends?" The man's jaw tightened. "Not yet." Victoria sat back slightly, lifting her tea to her lips. "Make sure it stays that way." Miss Marple turned slightly, just enough to catch the reflection of Victoria's face in the polished metal of the serving counter. Cool, composed, but beneath it, a certain tension. A woman used to winning, but now playing a game where the stakes were higher than she liked. Miss Marple reached for her cup of tea, the china warm against her fingers. The game, it seemed, was far from over. The records office was a world apart from the bustling corridors of the modern rail corporation. It was a place of order and routine, where paperwork held more authority than people, and the hum of overhead lights set the pace of the day. By late afternoon, most of the staff had gone home or moved on to more pressing duties, leaving the office wrapped in a hush that only deepened the weight of its contents. Miss Marple, or rather Mrs. White, sat at her desk, sorting through a stack of requisition forms with the air of a woman who found great comfort in mundane tasks. But her true attention lay elsewhere. Across the room, in a cabinet marked Restricted Files, was a folder labeled Test Run Confidential. It had been there all along, sitting quietly like an unclaimed secret. And Miss Marple had learned, long ago, that the most dangerous things were often in plain sight. She cast a glance toward the doorway, empty. Then, with the precision of a woman retrieving her netting, she pushed back her chair and drifted toward the cabinet, moving with the unhurried grace of someone simply tidying up. She reached for the handle. Locked, naturally. She allowed herself a small smile. "Then I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice was soft, low, carrying just enough warning to make Miss Marple pause. She turned, unruffled, to find Evelyn Fitzroy leaning against a filing cabinet, arms crossed, one eyebrow slightly raised. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "Oh dear, have I been caught?" Evelyn pushed off the cabinet, stepping closer. "Depends," she murmured. "Were you just a curious widow? Or are you looking for something you shouldn't be?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, as if considering. "I do find curiosity to be rather underrated, don't you?" Evelyn studied her for a moment, then sighed, glancing toward the door before reaching into her pocket. A key glinted in the dim light. "I never believed the official story either," she whispered. Miss Marple said nothing, merely watching as Evelyn fit the key into the lock and turned it with a quiet click. The cabinet door swung open. Evelyn reached inside, flipping through folders with practiced ease, until she pulled out a thick file. She placed it on the desk, hesitated, then looked at Miss Marple. "I've seen the memos," she said in a hushed tone. "Budget skyrocketing, deadlines ignored. Something's off, Mrs. White." Miss Marple's fingers grazed the edge of the file, eyes narrowing as she scanned the first few pages. Purchase orders for train components from an unknown supplier. The paper was crisp, the ink official, but something about it felt wrong. She turned a page. More orders. The sums were staggering, the timeline impossibly rushed. She exhaled slowly. "We mustn't jump to conclusions," she murmured. "But this is quite telling." Evelyn nodded, her jaw tight. "And if it's what I think it is, we're not the only ones looking." Miss Marple closed the file gently, but the weight of it settled between them. Outside, the office remained quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of routine. It was the silence of something lurking, just out of sight, waiting, The modern rail corporation had a different feel at night. The endless hum of activity was gone, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. The corridors, once bustling with engineers and executives, now stretched long and empty, the overhead lights buzzing faintly like a whisper of something unseen. Miss Marple moved carefully, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the polished floor. She carried herself with the unhurried poise of a woman who belonged exactly where she was, though in truth, she had no business being anywhere near the engineering lab. Evelyn's ID card was warm in her gloved hand. She had waited until the last of the staff had filtered out, their murmured farewells fading down the elevator shaft. Then, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime slipping through the cracks of polite society, she had stepped in the opposite direction. The door to the engineering lab loomed ahead, no grand security measures, just a simple keycard access panel. She slid the card through. A brief pause, then the light flicked green. Too easy, she thought. The door clicked open. Inside, the space was vast, the ceiling lined with exposed steel beams, long drafting tables arranged in precise rows. The air smelled of oil and ink, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic sterility of the upper offices. Blueprints were pinned across the walls, designs, schematics, the beating heart of MRC's latest innovation. She moved between the tables, scanning the scattered documents, her eyes sharp behind the gold-rimmed spectacles. Slipping gears, the phrase had been in Harvey Thorne's diary, his warning, but where was it now? Her fingers traced the edge of a blueprint, delicate but firm. It was a design for the high-speed train's braking system, dense with figures and notes in the margin. A few adjustments had been hastily marked in red ink, the handwriting tense and angular, unstable at higher velocities. Requires further testing. She frowned. If Harvey had known the system was flawed, had someone else known too? Had they chosen to push forward anyway? A rustling sound in the corridor snapped her out of her thoughts. Footsteps. Slow, measured, not the hurried clip of a janitor or a worker retrieving something forgotten. No, this was deliberate. Miss Marple exhaled slowly and ducked behind a drafting table. The footsteps stopped just outside the lab. Then, a voice, low, tense, on the phone. The new assistant, keep an eye on her. If she digs too deep, we'll have to handle it. A pause. Then a curt, no mistakes this time. Miss Marple's heart ticked a little faster. She pressed herself closer to the table, barely daring to breathe. The door opened just a crack, a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. A long moment passed. Then the door clicked shut again. Footsteps receded into the darkness. Miss Marple remained still, listening, waiting. Then, finally, she exhaled. They already suspect me. She adjusted her spectacles, smoothed her skirt, and reached for the blueprint. If they were watching her, it only meant one thing. She was getting close. The corridor outside the engineering lab was empty when Miss Marple slipped out, but the silence felt weighted now, as if the shadows held secrets of their own. The air still carried the metallic scent of machine oil, and somewhere down the hall, the distant hum of an electrical generator buzzed like an uneasy whisper. She adjusted her spectacles and walked at a measured pace, back straight, every step purposeful. There was no need for haste that would only invite suspicion. If anyone were watching, they would see only a woman past her prime, an assistant who had lingered a little too long in the wrong place. And then, from just ahead, a voice cut through the quiet. "You're working late, Mrs. White." Miss Marple stopped. A man stood near the junction of the hallway, half in shadow, arms crossed, in an easy posture that didn't quite match the sharp glint in his eye. Dennis Griffiths. He had the look of a man who had spent too many years balancing on the fine line between innovation and catastrophe. His sleeves were rolled up, ink stains on his fingers, a smudge of oil near his collar. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his sharp features were softened only by the weary amusement in his gaze. Miss Marple's hand tightened slightly on her handbag. She had not heard him approach. Griffiths stepped closer, the light catching the fine lines around his eyes. We're all busy here, but it's nice to see new faces. How are you settling in? Miss Marple gave him a polite smile, the kind that revealed nothing but pleasantness. Oh, everyone has been so kind. Though the accident, so terrible, for the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Then it was gone. Griffiths exhaled, nodding. Yes, a tragedy. He looked down, as if choosing his words carefully. Accidents happen in cutting-edge research, Mrs. White. It's unfortunate, but we must move forward. His voice was even, but there was something in the way he said it too practiced, too prepared. Miss Marple tilted her head. Of course. But I do wonder if it was truly an accident. A muscle tensed in his jaw, so briefly she might have missed it. You've been here a day, and already you have theories. His tone was light, almost teasing. She chuckled softly. Oh dear me, no. Just an old woman's curiosity. Griffith studied her for a long moment. Then he motioned down the hall. Come, he said. Let's talk in my office. Miss Marple hesitated just long enough to make it seem natural, then nodded. His office was small but well kept, a desk stacked with blueprints and a large drafting board leaning against the wall. A scent of coffee and ink lingered in the air. He closed the door behind them, not hurriedly, not ominously, just enough to suggest that whatever he was about to say was not meant for outside ears. He sat behind the desk, fingers steepled. I imagine you have questions. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, watching him carefully. Only the kind worth asking. Griffiths let out a quiet breath, then leaned back in his chair, considering her. Outside, the hall remained silent. The office door, however, now felt more like a barrier than a courtesy. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, the movement small but deliberate. She had spent a lifetime recognizing the moment when an innocent conversation became something more. Dennis Griffiths knew something. The question now was, what side was he on? The cafe was the kind of place where conversations slipped between the cracks of hissing steam and clinking porcelain. The morning rush had begun to thin, leaving only the lingering scent of roasted coffee and the low murmur of the few patrons who had nowhere urgent to be. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting gold streaks across the checkered tile floor. Miss Marple sat in a corner booth, a modest cup of tea in front of her, its surface still untouched. She had positioned herself with a view of the entrance, the habit of a woman who understood that trouble, when expected, should never be met with one's back turned. Albert Thorne arrived 5 minutes late. He entered with the air of a man who had spent the morning looking over his shoulder. His coat was buttoned too high, his hat pulled too low, and his fingers twitched slightly as he pulled out the chair opposite her. Miss Marple, he greeted, voice tight. Mr. Thorne, she returned, watching as he fumbled with his pocket before producing a battered leather notebook. He placed it between them like a confession. Miss Marple reached for it delicately, her fingers brushing over the worn cover. The leather was cracked, the edges softened by frequent use. It was Harvey's, Albert said, voice low. I found it hidden in his flat, wedged behind a radiator. If they'd searched his place, they didn't find this. Miss Marple flipped the cover open, skimming the first few pages. Neat, methodical handwriting filled the margins, calculations, sketches, notes on structural integrity. But as she turned the pages, the script grew less technical, more frantic. Albert leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. These entries, they prove he suspected parts were intentionally faulty. Miss Marple's breath caught. She adjusted her spectacles and read aloud. Rushed assembly. Modified components. Brakes not tested at high velocity. They know it won't hold. She looked up. Albert's expression was grim. She turned another page. The ink was smudged, the handwriting more erratic. They wanted to fail. It's not about speed, it's about what happens when it crashes. A spectacle. A catastrophe. She pressed her lips together. He believed certain executives wanted a catastrophic demonstration to drive stock manipulations. Albert nodded stiffly. That train was worth millions, but the company's value was worth more. If an accident happened during a test run, they could cover it up, spin it into something new. A tragedy, yes, but also a justification to demand more funding, new contracts, emergency adjustments. Miss Marple ran her fingers over the page. The ink had bled slightly, as if it had been written in haste. A quiet moment passed before she spoke. "It's worse than I feared," she murmured. Then, almost to herself, "people's lives sacrificed for profit." Albert's hands curled into fists on the table, and my brother saw it coming. A waiter passed by, refilling cups with mechanical efficiency. The sound of fresh coffee being poured into someone else's cup felt indecently ordinary in the weight of what they had just uncovered. Miss Marple closed the journal with quiet precision. Albert sat rigid, his knuckles white. "What do we do?" Miss Marple lifted her tea, taking a small sip. It was lukewarm now. "We do," she said calmly, "what your brother couldn't." Albert swallowed hard. "Which is?" She set her cup down and met his gaze. "We expose them." Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the quiet conspiracy unraveling in a corner cafe. But Miss Marple had never been one to let sleeping secrets lie. The cafe was behind her now, its warmth and quiet conspiracies left to dissolve into the morning hum of London. The street, too, was alive again, paperboys shouting headlines, trolley cars rattling along the rails, the clipped heels of hurried businessmen weaving through the ebb and flow of daily commerce. But Miss Marple had always preferred places where things moved a little slower. She settled onto a weathered bench in the small park across the street, tucking Harvey Thorne's journal into a handbag with a deliberate air. The morning was crisp, the air rich with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Overhead, the great chestnut trees swayed, their thinning canopies whispering secrets down to the solitary figure seated below. Albert Thorne hovered at the edge of the path, his nerves still raw, his fingers working absently at the brim of his hat. He wasn't a man used to waiting, not when so much had already been taken from him. "We have enough," he said suddenly, his voice strained but firm. "Harvey's notes, his suspicions. We take this to the authorities now, and they'll have to—" Miss Marple lifted a gloved hand, just a fraction, but it was enough. He stopped. She turned her head slightly, watching a pair of well-dressed women pass by, their conversation lilting with idle talk of fashion and invitations. They were close enough to overhear a carelessly spoken word. Miss Marple's gaze remained distant, but her meaning was clear: "Not here. Not yet." When the women had drifted out of earshot, she spoke softly, but her words held a quiet weight. "The truth must stand on firm ground, Mr. Thorne. We must be certain, no matter the cost." Albert let out a breath, sinking onto the bench beside her. "How much more certain do we need to be?" My brother was afraid. He saw the sabotage, wrote it down. His voice caught, and he shook his head. "They killed him for it." Miss Marple's hands remained folded in her lap, calm. "And if we go to the authorities now, what do we give them? A collection of notes, suspicions." She turned to him, her blue eyes sharp beneath the gold-rimmed spectacles. "Or do we give them something that cannot be denied?" Albert looked at her then, truly looked, and something in his expression changed. He had underestimated her. "They'll come after you," he said quietly. Miss Marple smiled faintly, as if the notion amused her. That would be a mistake on their part. Albert exhaled, his shoulders sagging. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. A trolley bell clanged in the distance. A breeze stirred the hem of Miss Marple's coat as she rose, gripping the handle of her handbag with quiet resolve. "We still have work to do." She turned and walked back toward the city, back toward MRC, back toward the den of polished ambition and hidden threats. Albert watched her go, then glanced toward the shifting autumn leaves. The wind had picked up. A storm was coming. And Miss Marple was walking straight into it. The records office had the stale hush of a place that had been emptied of life, but not of purpose. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, sharp-edged shadows against the rows of neatly stacked filing cabinets. It was late, too late for anyone, but the truly dedicated or the dangerously curious. Evelyn Fitzroy stood near Victoria Ramsay's desk, her breath shallow, her fingers clutching a single sheet of paper like a confession pulled from the wreckage. Her sharp brown eyes darted toward Miss Marple, who remained composed, watching. "I saw it, plain as day," Evelyn whispered, a voice barely above the hum of the overhead lights. She tapped the memo with one finger, a short, clip movement that betrayed the tension running through her. "They didn't want a safety inspection. It's right here." Miss Marple stepped forward, her gloved hand reaching for the paper with deliberate care. The memo was short, cold, deceptively simple in its phrasing. "Special bonus for accelerated results. Ensure no mechanical inspection occurs before the test run." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the paper. "Bonus for accelerated results," she murmured. So they banked on a successful demonstration, or perhaps an orchestrated failure. Evelyn swallowed. "Harvey knew," she said, her voice raw with realization. "He must have seen something, maybe an adjustment to the braking system, maybe a part swapped at the last minute. But he knew." Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the memo. The words were unassuming, the kind of corporate shorthand that would glance off most readers without raising alarm. But to someone who understood the weight of what lay behind them, the meaning was unmistakable. They had never intended to test the train safely. They had intended to ensure that it failed. Evelyn exhaled sharply, shaking her head. This means people knew, Ramsay. Whoever else signed off on this. They let it happen. Miss Marple lifted her gaze, her expression unreadable. "The question is why?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded toward the filing cabinet behind Ramsay's desk. "If there's more, it'll be in there." Miss Marple glanced toward the door, the hair at the back of her neck prickling. A familiar sensation. A warning. She had spent a lifetime reading people, reading rooms, reading moments that shifted just slightly off kilter. And right now the air felt wrong. She placed the memo back on the desk. "Not tonight." Evelyn blinked. "But they already suspect me," Miss Marple said calmly. "If they suspect you as well, we'll never get another chance." Evelyn swallowed but nodded. Miss Marple smoothed the paper down, making sure it looked untouched. Then, with quiet efficiency, she straightened her coat and lifted her handbag from the desk. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we shall be very careful." Evelyn hesitated, then reached for a folder, pretending to organize the desk. "And if we're not?" Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "Then I suppose we shall be very clever instead." The hush of the records office deepened. Beyond the door, the corridor remained empty, but the silence no longer felt like solitude. It felt like something waiting. The hallway was too quiet. It stretched long and narrow beneath the harsh flicker of overhead lights, the sterile white walls gleaming faintly. The evening shift had filtered out, leaving only the low hum of distant machinery and the occasional echo of footsteps against polished floors. Miss Marple, ever the picture of unassuming efficiency, walked at a measured pace, her handbag tucked neatly at her side. She had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing precisely where she was meant to be, even when she wasn't. But something in the air had changed. A presence, a shift in the silence. Then Mrs. White. The voice was smooth, practiced. The kind of voice that slid through boardrooms and negotiations like a knife through silk. Miss Marple turned. Victoria Ramsay stood just beyond the bend in the corridor, poised, collected. The glow of the overhead lighting sharpened the angles of her face, casting subtle shadows beneath her high cheekbones. Her dark blue dress expensive, understated fit her like armor. She smiled, thinly. "I do hope you're finding your work fulfilling, Mrs. White," she said. "We value loyalty here at MRC." Miss Marple's hands remained folded over her handbag. "I'm quite happy. Everyone has been most accommodating." Victoria's gaze didn't waver. "Good. We like to ensure our employees feel at home." Of course, she stepped closer, voice dropping just a fraction. "That requires a certain level of trust, wouldn't you agree?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, as if considering. "Trust is such a valuable thing." Victoria studied her. A woman accustomed to control, to reading people. to measuring their weaknesses before they realized they had any. Miss Marple merely smiled, mild and pleasant. A beat of silence, then Victoria leaned in, just enough for her words to land precisely where they were meant. "Some can't keep secrets well," she murmured. "They pay a high price." Miss Marple's fingers brushed against the clasp of her handbag. A slow, deliberate movement. The threat had been delivered. Victoria straightened, smoothing a hand down the front of her dress. "Enjoy your evening, Mrs. White." And then she was gone, heels clicking softly against the tile as she disappeared down the corridor. Miss Marple remained still for a moment, listening to the feeding sound of footsteps. Then, with quiet precision, she exhaled. The game had changed. If she continued digging, she might become the next accident. And yet, as she turned and resumed her path, her pace remained steady. Because now, she was certain. She was very, very close. The archives were the forgotten belly of the modern rail corporation, a place where old blueprints and dusty ledgers waited to be swallowed by time. The overhead lights flickered, their glow dim and yellow, casting uneasy shadows across the rows of metal filing cabinets. Miss Marple sat at a narrow wooden table, the kind designed for quiet clerks who never asked too many questions. Across from her, Evelyn Fitzroy leaned forward, her fingers curled around a fountain pen like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Albert Thorne paced near the shelves, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his jaw tight with restless energy. Miss Marple, calm as ever, tapped her fingers lightly against the table. "We must let the truth come to light in front of everyone, officials, reporters, the public. They can't silence us all." Albert let out a quiet scoff. "They'll try." Evelyn pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "They're already trying." She set a folder down with more force than necessary. "I checked the internal system this morning. Files have been disappearing. Not just Thorne's records. Everything related to the test run. If we wait too long, there won't be anything left." Miss Marple regarded her for a moment. "Then we must make sure they don't succeed." Evelyn exhaled sharply, nodding. "I'll schedule a system backup for the same time as the press event, route everything to an off-site storage unit. Even if they delete files, we'll have them." Albert stopped pacing, his shoulders still tense. "That's fine for records. But we need something the public can understand. Financial reports are one thing, but people don't pay attention to numbers. They pay attention to consequences." Miss Marple nodded. "Then we show them." Evelyn frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple laced her fingers together, eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Photographs of the doctored parts. Blueprints showing the modifications. Proof that the train was designed to fail." Albert let out a low breath. "That means getting into the engineering lab again." Evelyn stiffened. "That's impossible." Miss Marple simply smiled. "Not impossible, my dear. Just rather difficult." Albert glanced between them. "Let's assume we pull this off. What's the endgame?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "We present it all at the press event. In front of Victoria Ramsay, in front of the board, and in front of the people who hold MRC accountable." A silence stretched between them. The weight of risk settled into the dimly lit room. Evelyn was the first to break it. She picked up the pen, her expression heartening. "Then we'd better do it right." Miss Marple smiled, just slightly. The trap was set. Now all they needed was the right moment to spring it. The engineering workshop was a cathedral of steel and shadow. By day it was a hive of activity machinists bent over schematics, sparks flying from welding torches, the air thick with the scent of grease and hot metal. But at night it was something else entirely. The great unfinished train engines loomed like sleeping beasts, their hulking frames cast in long, slanted shadows from the overhead lamps left burning. The rhythmic ticking of cooling metal filled the hush, an uneasy heartbeat in the stillness. Miss Marple moved carefully between the rows of equipment, her footsteps feather light against the concrete floor. The small camera in her gloved hands was steady, her grip sure as she raised it and clicked the shutter. The flash was brief, a white-hot flicker against the darkness. She lowered the camera and adjusted her spectacles, inspecting the engine component in front of her. Stamped into the metal was a label substandard. Not a word one expected to find on the core mechanics of a machine designed to push the limits of speed. Miss Marple frowned. She took another photograph, then slid the camera back into her handbag. With careful fingers, she reached into the open panel of the engine and pried loose a small circuit board. It was unassuming, just another piece of hardware, its serial numbers etched in tiny script. But when she tilted it under the dim light, she saw what she had suspected: tampered numbers. The original code had been scratched away and reprinted. Someone had swapped the part, made sure it would fail under pressure. She slipped the board into her pocket. Then a sound. A footstep. She turned, her breath held tight in her chest. Emerging from the darkness was a figure she knew. Dennis Griffiths. His coat was unbuttoned, his shirt sleeves pushed up, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He looked exhausted, as though he had already fought and lost whatever battle had been raging inside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "If you're looking for proof, you won't need much more than that." Miss Marple didn't move, didn't speak. She had spent a lifetime reading people, and Dennis Griffiths had the look of a man carrying a secret too heavy to bear any longer. He ran a hand through his hair. "They forced me into it," he muttered. "Victoria, the board. They knew I was drowning in debt. They told me if I didn't go along, they'd ruin me." His voice cracked slightly. "But I never wanted anyone to die." Miss Marple took a slow step forward. Her voice when she spoke was gentle but firm. "Then help us put an end to this." Dennis let out a shuddering breath. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. A folded blueprint. He held it out, his fingers trembling. "This is everything," he said hoarsely. "They replaced parts to ensure a crash." Miss Marple took the document with careful hands, unfolding it under the dim workshop light. The annotations, the replacements, the deliberate flaws, it was all there. Undeniable. Her heartbeat steadied. She had what she needed. Dennis exhaled, rubbing his face. "They'll come after you." Miss Marple tucked the blueprint into her handbag, her eyes gleaming behind her spectacles. "They can try," she said softly. Then she turned and walked into the night, bracing for the final showdown. The grand showroom of the Modern Rail Corporation was a temple to ambition. Bright chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, their light bouncing off polished brass railings and marble floors. A sleek, scaled model of the high-speed train stood at the center of the stage, its streamlined body gleaming under the spotlights. The room pulsed with anticipation. Reporters clutched notepads, their pens poised like weapons. Investors, draped in tailored suits and quiet calculation, sipped champagne, their eyes darting toward the executives lining the stage. Officials from the transport board stood near the front, their expressions a careful mix of curiosity and skepticism. Then, with practiced poise, Victoria Ramsay stepped onto the stage. The crowd stilled. A moment of silence. Then the cameras flashed. Victoria was the picture of corporate elegance: navy dress, high heels clicking against the stage floor, confidence emanating from every measured step. She approached the microphone with the air of a woman delivering a coronation speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice crisp, carrying across the showroom. "The Modern Rail Corporation stands at the forefront of innovation." The audience leaned in. Behind the scenes, Miss Marple, Evelyn Fitzroy, Albert Thorne, and Dennis Griffiths moved with quiet precision. Evelyn stood near a technician, her fingers flying over the backup system, ensuring their files were safe. Albert adjusted a stack of folders, their pages holding the damning financial records. Dennis, his hands still unsteady but his resolve set, clutched the blueprint that detailed the sabotage. And Miss Marple? She was not in the showroom. Not yet. Near the front, a reporter frowned, scanning the room. He leaned toward a colleague. "Where's Miss Marple?" he whispered. She said she had something urgent. Another flash of cameras. Victoria Ramsay smiled, basking in the moment. She had no idea that within minutes, the floor beneath her carefully built empire was about to collapse. Miss Marple was coming. And so was the truth. The hush that fell over the grand showroom was the kind that only came before disaster. Victoria Ramsay had been mid-sentence, her polished voice painting a bright future of rail innovation, when the disturbance began. First, a rustle among the reporters. Then, the distinct click-click of camera shutters going off at the wrong moment. And then I believe it's time we had a different perspective on progress. The voice was steady, clipped with the crisp edges of quiet authority. It was not the voice of Mrs. Margaret White, the Meek Records assistant. It was the voice of Miss Agatha Marple, heads turned. Whispers coiled through the air like smoke, and at the foot of the stage, standing with an air of polite but unwavering determination, was a small woman in a sensible coat, her gloved hands resting neatly on her handbag. Miss Marple stepped forward, past the bewildered security men who weren't quite sure whether stopping an elderly woman was part of their job description. Victoria Ramsay's fingers curled around the microphone stand, her smile a thin veneer over something much sharper. "I beg your pardon." Miss Marple clasped her hands, her tone as calm as a cup of afternoon tea. "I am Miss Marple, here to expose a terrible conspiracy." The words sliced through the room. A reporter bolted upright. Someone in the back coughed, the sound nervous. Miss Marple continued, unbothered by the stunned faces now locked onto her. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a crime hidden beneath the polished veneer of industry. Harvey Thorne was murdered for trying to reveal the truth." Her voice, firm but unhurried, carried through the showroom. "Here," she said, pulling out a file with methodical precision, "are the incriminating records, falsified budgets, inferior components, all sanctioned by Victoria Ramsay and certain associates within this company." She opened the folder, holding up pages of contracts, purchase orders, engineering modifications, all leading to one undeniable truth. Photographs of tampered engine parts, she continued, blueprints altered to ensure mechanical failure, financial statements showing hidden bonuses for those who agreed to the sabotage. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing. The tension in the room tightened like a noose. Victoria Ramsay let out a sharp laugh, too sharp. "This is outrageous," she snapped, her voice cutting through the crowd. "Lies." Miss Marple did not so much as blink. "I'm afraid the facts rather disagree with you." The weight of those words settled over the showroom like a heavy fog. Then a new voice, shaky, worn. Dennis Griffiths. He stepped forward, his face pale, his hands trembling at his sides. His voice, though weak, carried enough guilt to shake the foundations of the room. "It's true," he said, the words spilling out like a dam breaking. I'm sorry." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Victoria Ramsay's eyes flashed with something cold. "You fool," she hissed under her breath, barely audible over the rising chaos. But it was too late. A Ministry of Transport official, previously silent, previously indifferent, stepped forward, his expression grave. "This warrants immediate investigation," he declared. "MRC will answer for these allegations." The room erupted. Reporters shouted. Executives whispered frantically. Investors looked as though they had swallowed something sour. Miss Marple stood in the eye of the storm untouched, watching as the walls of deceit collapsed around them. Victoria Ramsay, no longer in control of the room, took a single step back. For the first time, her mask cracked. She had lost. Miss Marple, ever the quiet architect of truth, adjusted the clasp of her handbag. It was over. And everyone knew it. The weight of truth had settled over the grand showroom like a heavy fog, thick with the murmurs of disbelief and the sharp edges of scandal. Outside, police sirens wailed, their echo bouncing off the marble walls of the modern rail corporation. The men in uniform moved with quiet efficiency, their presence sending ripples of unease through the crowd. The scent of perfume and cigars mingled with the unmistakable staleness of sweat, fear, panic, reputations crumbling like old plaster. And at the center of it all, Victoria Ramsay stood defeated. Her carefully composed mask had shattered, the elegant confidence now a brittle thing. Gone was the woman who commanded boardrooms with a flick of her wrist. In her place stood someone cornered, outmaneuvered, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her like the final page of a tragic novel. The officers closed in. A hush fell over the room as they reached her, one stepping forward with the well-rehearsed calm of a man used to arresting people who once considered themselves untouchable. "Miss Ramsay," he said, his voice clipped, official. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, reckless endangerment, and obstruction of justice." She did not speak, did not protest, but as they led her through the crowd, her gaze found Miss Marple. For the briefest moment, something flickered in those sharp blue eyes, not fury, not defiance. Recognition. And then she was gone, swallowed by the uniformed procession. Past the journalists scribbling furiously. Past the investors already whispering about damage control. The modern rail corporation had built itself on speed, power, progress. Now, it had run straight into a wall. Albert Thorne stood near the edge of the room, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. His shoulders squared with the kind of exhaustion that didn't fade overnight. For months, his brother had been a ghost, a footnote in a manufactured tragedy. Tonight he was something more. Albert exhaled, glancing toward Miss Marple, who stood at a polite distance, watching with an expression that could only be called satisfaction. He stepped forward. "Thank you," he said, voice quieter than he'd meant it to be. "You've saved more lives than you know." Miss Marple, ever composed, gave the smallest tilt of her head. "One simply does one's duty, Mr. Thorne." A pause. Harvey deserved nothing less. The words were simple, but the weight they carried was immense. Albert swallowed hard, nodding. The gratitude sat between them, unspoken but understood. Outside, the night stretched long and quiet. Miss Marple stepped onto the pavement, fastening the clasp of her handbag with a quiet click. The air was cool, a breeze tugging at the hem of her coat. She did not linger for the headlines, did not wait for the flashing bulbs of photographers or the frantic reporters hungry for a quote. That was never why she did what she did. With a small, satisfied smile, she turned and walked into the city, her silhouette soon lost among the shifting tides of London. Another mystery solved, another truth uncovered, and as always Miss Marple had already moved on. The train to St. Mary Mead rattled along the countryside, the steady rhythm of the wheels a familiar comfort. The city, with its gleaming towers of ambition and shadows thick with deception, was behind her now. Out here the air was cleaner, the land rolling in green, unmarred by the machinery of progress. Miss Marple sat near the window, her hands folded neatly over her handbag, her gaze drifting across the landscape. She had read the morning's papers, of course the headlines thick with scandal. Victoria Ramsay arrested, the modern rail corporation under investigation, officials scrambling to distance themselves from the fallout. It was all very predictable. The guilty always protested, the public always gasped, and the world always moved on. The only thing that ever truly changed was who was left standing at the end of it all. Miss Marple, as always, had stepped quietly away from the wreckage. She arrived in St. Mary Mead just after midday. The station was as it had always been, modest, slightly worn at the edges, with a kindly porter who tipped his cap as she passed. The village itself stretched ahead, a picture of English tranquility, the streets lined with well-tended hedges and gossip, waiting to be plucked like ripe fruit. It was good to be home. By late afternoon she was seated in Mrs. Pettigrew's parlor, a cup of tea in hand, surrounded by the comforting scent of fresh scones and lavender sachets tucked into well-stuffed cushions. Her friends were already gathered, their curiosity sharpened by absence and the tantalizing promise of a tale yet untold. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Pettigrew said, adjusting her spectacles, "you've been away far too long. We were beginning to worry you'd taken a liking to the city." Miss Marple smiled, stirring her tea. "Oh, the city has its charms, I suppose, but one does get rather tired of all that rushing about." "And," pressed Miss Hartwell, leaning in slightly, "was there a murder?" A brief pause. The women watched her with barely contained anticipation. Miss Marple took a sip of tea. Yes, she said simply. A collective intake of breath. Good heavens, Mrs. Pettigrew clutched her pearls. And did you solve it? Miss Marple set her cup down with quiet precision. One does one's best. There was a moment of reverent silence. Then Miss Hartwell, ever the pragmatist, sighed. Really, Jane, I don't know how you find yourself in these situations. Miss Marple smiled, the kind of smile that came from knowing too much. Observation, my dear. People are never quite as good at keeping secrets as they believe. She sat back, feeling the warmth of the room, the ease of familiar company. The modern rail corporation had been built on speed, on power, on the belief that nothing could catch up with it. But in the end, justice had moved faster. Miss Marple, as always, had simply waited for the right moment to step ahead. She reached for another scone. The world, after all, was full of mysteries. But for now, just for now, she was quite content to let them wait.